arrogant student laughed at the black girl's accent until she gave a speech that won a global award. The auditorium buzzed with the restless energy of students waiting for their debate class to begin. It wasn't just any class. This was the advanced public speaking course that only the top students were allowed to enter. For many, it was their golden ticket to national competitions, scholarships, and recognition that could change their futures. Among them sat Amara, a black girl who had only recently transferred to the prestigious academy. She was brilliant. Her essays sparkled with ideas. Her research stood out for its depth. But what most students noticed about her wasn't her intelligence. It was her accent. Born in Nigeria and raised in a household that valued tradition, Amara's English carried the rich tones and rhythms of her roots. It wasn't broken, it wasn't wrong. But in a place where polished American diction was seen as the standard of success, her voice became the first target for ridicule. At the front of the class sat Jason, the school's most arrogant student. Tall, wealthy, and confident, he had always been the loudest voice in the room. To Jason, winning was second nature, and mocking others was his favorite sport. When Amara introduced herself that day, her soft-spoken words carried an accent that Jason immediately seized upon. He leaned back in his chair, smirked, and then burst out laughing. The sound was sharp, cruel, and infectious. A few others chuckled nervously, not because they thought it was funny, but because no one wanted to oppose Jason. For Amara, the moment felt like a blade cutting through her skin. She had known the world could be harsh, but here, among supposed future leaders, she had hoped for respect. The teacher tried to regain control, but Jason's laughter lingered in the air, echoing in Amara's mind long after the introductions ended. She sat quietly, gripping her notebook, her knuckles white with pressure. She wanted to disappear, to fade into the background. But another part of her, deep and unshakable, simmered with determination. She thought of her parents back home, who had sacrificed everything to send her to this academy. She thought of her grandmother, who once told her, "Your voice carries the power of your ancestors. Never let anyone silence it." Amara knew Jason saw her accent as weakness, but what he couldn't see yet was that behind that accent lay an intelligence and resilience that no amount of mockery could break. Still, the humiliation of that first day planted a seed, not of defeat, but of resolve. Amara silently promised herself that one day she would make every single one of them, Jason included, eat their laughter. What she didn't know then was that the opportunity would come in a way that shocked not just her class, not just her school, but the entire world. Amara's humiliation on that first day did not end with Jason's laughter. It followed her through the corridors, into the cafeteria, and even across the campus lawns. Jason's smirk became a shadow at her back, his words replaying in her mind like a cruel echo. He wasn't finished either. Jason was the kind of student who needed an audience, and Amara's accent gave him endless material. Whenever she spoke up in class, his eyebrows would arch dramatically, as if trying to decode her words. Sometimes he would mimic her speech under his breath, drawing quiet chuckles from those too timid to challenge him. To the teachers, Jason played the role of the gifted star. He participated enthusiastically, delivered answers with confidence, and wore his arrogance like a badge. To his classmates, he was both admired and feared. No one wanted to be his next target, so they stood by silently while Amara endured the ridicule. But Amara wasn't weak. Every laugh at her expense cut her deeply, but it also sharpened her resolve. She knew what they couldn't see, the countless nights. She had spent reading speeches by Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She had studied the rhythm of words, the strength of delivery, and the way voices could move nations. She may have carried an accent, but her words carried weight. Her accent wasn't a flaw, it was a story, a living reminder of where she came from. Each syllable bore history, culture, and strength. But in that academy, surrounded by students who equated proper English with superiority, Amara's voice became both her gift and her burden. Jason's mockery, however, lit a fire in her. She began to practice even harder, not to erase her accent, but to control her delivery with precision. She stood in front of mirrors at night, rehearsing speeches until her voice was steady and unshakable. She recorded herself, studied her tone, and refined her pauses. She knew her accent would never vanish, and she didn't want it to. But she wanted her words to be so powerful that no one would dare laugh again. The turning point came when their debate coach announced an upcoming inter-academy speech competition. It wasn't just a local event. It was the qualifier for a national tournament, where scouts from universities and international organizations often sat in the audience. The announcement sent ripples through the class. Jason immediately declared he would represent the academy, boasting that no one could match his eloquence. His friends clapped him on the back, already convinced he would win. But the coach had other plans. Instead of handpicking a student, he announced that each member of the class would deliver a preliminary speech, and the top performer would be chosen. Jason smirked at Amara, his eyes gleaming with the promise of another opportunity to humiliate her. He whispered just loud enough for others to hear. "Guess we'll need a translator when Amara speaks." The laughter that followed burned in her ears. Yet inside, Amara felt a surge of determination unlike anything before. This was her chance, not only to prove herself, but to dismantle Jason's arrogance in the most public way possible. That night, she poured her soul into preparing her speech. She wrote about resilience, about the beauty of diversity, about the power of voices that dared to sound different. She infused her words with the strength of her ancestors, the dreams of her parents, and the quiet fire of every moment she had endured in silence. By the time the day of the preliminaries arrived, Amara was no longer the timid transfer student clenching her notebook. She was a storm waiting to be unleashed. Jason thought he was walking into a contest he had already won. What he didn't realize was that the very girl he mocked for her accent was about to use that same voice to shake the ground beneath his feet. And when Amara stepped onto the stage, the entire room would learn that laughter could be silenced with nothing more than truth spoken boldly. The day of the preliminaries dawned with the kind of tension that felt almost electric. Students buzzed across the campus, rehearsing lines under their breath, clutching note cards, and nervously checking their outfits. For many, this competition was about prestige and a chance to stand out. For Jason, it was about ego. And for Amara, it was about survival, vindication, and something far greater, silencing the ridicule that had haunted her since her first day. The auditorium filled quickly. Teachers, administrators, and students from across the academy settled into their seats, eager to watch their peers perform. On stage, a simple podium stood beneath a glaring spotlight. It looked ordinary, but to Amara, it felt like an altar where reputations would either be built or broken. Jason sat near the front, leaning back in his chair with the smug ease of someone already convinced of victory. His friends whispered and laughed, throwing glances in Amara's direction, as if she were nothing more than a footnote in Jason's inevitable triumph. The coach called the first student to the stage, and the preliminaries began. One by one, students delivered speeches, some passionate, others shaky, a few impressive enough to draw polite applause. Jason's turn came halfway through. He rose from his seat with theatrical confidence, adjusting his tie as though cameras were flashing for him alone. His speech was polished, full of elaborate vocabulary and dramatic pauses. He spoke about ambition, leadership, and success, his words flowing with practiced ease. The audience nodded, teachers scribbled notes, and Jason basked in the attention like a king receiving the praise of his court. When he finished, the applause was loud, though not overwhelming. Still, Jason bowed slightly, as though he had already secured the crown. He glanced at Amara as he walked off the stage, his smirk daring her to try to follow in his footsteps. Then came her name. Amara stood slowly, clutching the small set of note cards she had written, but hardly needed any more. As she walked to the stage, she felt every eye in the room on her. The whispers began even before she reached the podium. Is she really going to do this? She can't possibly match Jason. Her accent's so heavy, no one will understand her. Each murmur stabbed at her, but instead of breaking her, they hardened her resolve. She had heard these doubts before, and she had been preparing for this exact moment. When she stepped behind the podium, the spotlight hit her face, and for a brief second, she felt the weight of fear pressing against her chest. But then she remembered the long nights, the voices of her parents urging her to stand tall, and the speeches of leaders who had once been dismissed because of how they sounded, where they came from, or the color of their skin. She looked up, scanning the room, not with fear, but with calm fire. And then she began. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and unshakable. Yes, her accent was there, rich and undeniable. But instead of weakening her words, it gave them rhythm, melody, and authenticity. She spoke not about ambition or personal glory, but about the power of voice, how every person's way of speaking, no matter how different, carried history, culture, and value. She painted vivid pictures with her words, of her grandmother telling stories under starlit skies, of her mother teaching her that strength was not in silence but in speaking boldly, of how voices had built revolutions and broken chains. The room, which had been restless a moment ago, fell into complete silence. Students leaned forward in their seats, captivated not by her accent but by the weight of her message. Even the teachers who had initially scribbled, distracted, notes now stared at her with wide eyes, their pens frozen in midair. Jason, who had been smirking at first, slowly shifted in his seat. His confidence faltered as he realized something he had never considered. The girl he mocked was commanding the room, with a power he could never imitate. Amara's words built like a rising storm. She spoke of dignity, of resilience, of the beauty in difference. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was firm, measured, and powerful, carrying the kind of conviction that no performance could replicate. By the time she reached her conclusion, there was no sound in the room except for the steady cadence of her voice. Her final words landed like thunder, reverberating in the hearts of everyone present. And then, silence. A long, stunned silence that stretched until it became undeniable. The first clap came from the back, then another, and then the auditorium erupted into applause, louder and longer than for any other speaker that day. Students stood to their feet, teachers clapped with genuine awe, and the coach's face lit with a pride that could not be hidden. Amara stood at the podium, her chest rising and falling, her heart pounding, not with fear anymore but with triumph. She had not just delivered a speech, she had delivered a reckoning. Jason sat frozen, his face pale, his smirk erased. For the first time, he was not the one commanding attention. For the first time, he was the one being overshadowed. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew the competition was no longer about who sounded the most polished. It was about who carried truth in their voice. And Amara had just shown them all. The echoes of Amara's victory in the preliminary round rippled far beyond that single auditorium. Word spread quickly across the academy how the girl who had been mocked for her accent had silenced an entire room and left, her peers standing in ovation. Teachers whispered about her potential, students replayed her lines in hushed awe, and even administrators who had once overlooked her began to see her as someone different, someone destined for more. But for Jason, the humiliation was unbearable. All his life, he had been the one with the spotlight, the top of his class, the natural speaker, the one everyone expected to win. Now, his crown had been cracked by a girl he had dismissed as inferior. Each replay of Amara's standing ovation gnawed at his pride, turning envy into resentment and resentment into obsession. He convinced himself that her success was a fluke, that the judges had been swayed by pity or novelty. He told his friends that the real competition was still ahead, and he would crush her when it mattered. But beneath his bravado, cracks began to show. For the first time, Jason was preparing not from confidence, but from fear. Meanwhile, Amara entered a new phase of preparation. She had advanced to the national level competition, where the brightest students from across the country would gather. This was no longer just about proving herself to her school. It was about standing before an audience that included political leaders, scholars, and global figures. At night, she studied recordings of past champions. She dissected the way they held their pauses, the stories they told, the emotions they evoked. But she didn't try to copy them. Instead, she refined her own voice, sharpening her words with honesty, and grounding them in the truth of her experiences. She knew her accent would be heard on a much larger stage, and she refused to soften or disguise it. Instead, she leaned into it, shaping it into her strength. Proof that power did not need to sound like everyone else. The journey to nationals was grueling. She spent hours in empty classrooms, rehearsing until her voice cracked. Her coach pushed her harder than ever, urging her to dig deeper, to make her words not just heard but felt. Every stumble was corrected, every hesitation challenged. Jason, too, was preparing, but his approach was different. His speeches grew more elaborate, his gestures more dramatic. He layered his performance with expensive polish, hoping to reclaim his superiority through grandeur. Yet no matter how much he rehearsed, he couldn't shake the memory of the silence that had filled the auditorium after Amara's speech, silence that had been heavier and more powerful than any applause he had ever received. Finally, the day of the national competition arrived. The venue was a grand auditorium, far larger and more intimidating than the one at their academy. Banners hung from the walls, lights blazed across the stage, and cameras were set up to broadcast the event to audiences far beyond those seated inside. It wasn't just a contest anymore. It was a performance that could echo across the world. Contestants arrived from every corner of the country, each carrying their own unique story. their own hopes and anxieties. Some were children of politicians, others prodigies from elite schools. Yet among them, Amara stood out. Not because she was the loudest or the most decorated, but because of the quiet, unshakable determination in her eyes. Jason noticed it too. As he watched her move through the venue with calm focus, he realized she was no longer the same girl he had laughed at weeks ago. Something in her had shifted. She was no longer trying to prove she belonged. She knew she did. The preliminaries at Nationals began, and contestant after contestant delivered speeches of high caliber. The audience was treated to eloquence, wit, and carefully crafted arguments. Jason performed strongly, commanding the stage with practiced charisma. He received loud applause, the kind that seemed to affirm his belief that he was reclaiming his throne. Then came Amara's turn. As she walked to the podium, Jason leaned forward in his seat, convinced that this would be the moment she faltered. The national stage was bigger, harsher, less forgiving. Surely her accent would seem out of place here. Surely the judges would prefer polish over authenticity. But once again he underestimated her. Amara began slowly, deliberately, drawing the audience in with quiet strength. She spoke of global unity, of voices from different nations and cultures weaving together into a tapestry of progress. She told stories from her homeland, of resilience in the face of adversity, of how language itself carried history, pain, and triumph. Her words painted vivid pictures, markets alive with voices calling in many tongues, classrooms where children learned in dialects passed down for centuries, the echoes of ancestors whose songs carried through generations. She didn't ask the audience to tolerate her difference. She demanded that they recognize its value. This time, the silence in the room was even heavier, more profound. Even those watching from the farthest seats leaned forward, caught in the gravity of her presence. Judges exchanged glances, impressed not just with her message, but with the way she delivered it, with conviction that no performance could mimic. When she ended, the applause was thunderous. Some in the audience rose to their feet without hesitation, clapping until their palms stung. The cameras caught it all. The standing ovation, the tears in the eyes of strangers, the way her name echoed through the auditorium. Jason once again sat frozen. The confidence he had built like armor shattered in an instant. For the second time, he realized he was not battling a competitor. He was facing a force of nature, someone who was rewriting the rules of what it meant to win. And yet the competition was not over. The judges announced the finalists, and as expected, both Jason and Amara advanced to the final round. The entire auditorium buzzed with anticipation. 2 names, 2 rivals, 1 stage, 1 last chance to prove who truly deserved the crown. But what Jason didn't realize was that this final round would not just determine the winner of a competition. It would open doors far beyond their imagination. And for Amara, it was only the beginning. The tension in the auditorium was electric as the finalists prepared for the final round. The stage lights glared brighter than ever, and the silence that filled the vast hall seemed almost sacred, as though everyone present knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. The announcer's voice carried through the room as the names of the 2 last competitors were read aloud. Jason, the golden boy of elite schools, and Amara, the girl whose voice had turned ridicule into reverence. The crowd erupted in applause for both, though the cheers for Amara carried a different kind of energy, an almost desperate hope, as if people were rooting not just for her, but for what she represented. Jason stepped forward first. His speech was powerful, polished, and deliberate. He spoke about leadership, ambition, and the importance of striving for excellence. His delivery was as crisp as ever, his gestures commanding, his tone confident. He ended with a dramatic flourish, his final words echoing off the auditorium walls. The applause was loud, long, and approving. Jason looked triumphant once more, his pride swelling as he bowed. But deep down, even he knew something was missing. His performance was technically flawless, but it lacked the fire that moved people's souls. It was a performance built to impress, not to connect. Then it was Amara's turn. She walked to the stage with calm composure, her footsteps steady despite the weight of countless eyes on her. She didn't adjust her accent. She didn't try to soften it. Instead, she began with it, leaning into it as though daring anyone to judge her for it again. Her topic was not about herself, but about voices. She spoke of how voices have been silenced throughout history. Voices of women denied education. Voices of children ignored because of where they were born. Voices of people mocked because of the way they spoke. She told the audience that an accent is not a flaw. It is proof of heritage, culture, and resilience. Every tone, every inflection carried the story of survival and identity. Her speech flowed like poetry, weaving history with personal truth. She spoke of her own struggles, not as complaints, but as symbols of strength. She described the humiliation of being laughed at, the sting of being underestimated, and the quiet fire that kept her going. Then she turned her words outward, speaking to everyone listening, urging them to recognize the beauty of diversity. Her voice grew stronger, filling the hall with emotion. She didn't need dramatic gestures. Her words alone carried weight. Each sentence landed like a strike on the hearts of the audience, leaving them breathless, captivated. And then, her closing lines. She raised her chin, her voice unwavering, and declared that the world does not advance by silencing accents, but by amplifying them. That the truest leaders are not those who speak the loudest, but those who dare to speak their truth, even when mocked for it. The silence that followed was unlike any silence before. It was deep, charged, and overwhelming. Then, slowly, the first clap began. One person stood, then another, and another, until the entire auditorium rose in unison, applauding with thunderous force. Some had tears in their eyes. Others clapped until their hands reddened. The cameras panned across the room, capturing faces lit with awe. Jason sat in his seat, his hands limp, his expression frozen. He knew, as did everyone else in that hall, that no matter how flawless his performance had been, Amara had delivered something untouchable. When the judges returned to announce the winner, the result was no surprise. Amara's name rang through the hall, carried on waves of applause and cheers. She stood, humbled but radiant, tears glistening as the spotlight fell upon her. But the story didn't end there. Her speech went viral. Within hours, clips flooded social media, spreading across platforms, translated into multiple languages. Commentators praised her courage. Educators shared her words with their students. And activists across the globe cited her speech as a rallying cry. Soon, invitations began pouring in. International conferences, global youth summits, and even televised news interviews. Amara's voice had transcended the competition. She had become a symbol of resilience, authenticity, and the power of embracing one's identity. Meanwhile, Jason faded into the background. His arrogance, once his armor, now weighed on him like chains. He became a cautionary tale of what happens when pride blinds one to true greatness. His name was remembered only in contrast to hers, a reminder of who had tried to laugh her off the stage, only to watch her rise higher than he ever could. Months later, Amara stood on an even larger stage. This time at a global award ceremony in front of world leaders, dignitaries, and millions watching across continents. She was honored not just for her victory in a competition, but for the way she had ignited a global conversation about diversity, dignity, and the value of every voice. As she stepped forward to receive the award, she thought back to that first humiliating laugh, the day her accent was mocked. She realized now that what had once been her deepest insecurity had become her greatest power. The world was listening to her, not despite her accent, but because of it. And somewhere in the audience, Jason watched silently, unable to deny the truth anymore. The girl he once laughed at had changed the world. Amara had not just won a competition. She had rewritten the narrative of what it meant to belong, to lead, and to inspire. And as the ovation thundered around her once again, she finally smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning of her journey.